Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg, and in this video, I'm going to discuss the mindset we should have when it comes to making life choices, particularly big life choices that are going to impact a significant part of our life, or maybe even direct the rest of our lives. And there are a lot of big decisions that we may have to make in life. Maybe you're trying to figure out, am I going to go to college? If so, where? What am I going to study? Or, kind of going into that career. Maybe you're trying to figure that out of, where am I going to work? What am I going to do for my career? Where am I going to live? Am I going to kind of stay local to where I grew up, or am I going to go somewhere else? And maybe we try to, you know, stay calm in the midst of making these decisions and try to keep our peace of mind. But, maybe we just have this feeling too much of, you don't understand. I need to get this right. And I can sympathize with that. I've had times before where I would kind of get some angst build up of, I need to make the right decision. I need to make sure that these choices I'm making are actually what I should do, because I can really mess my life up if I don't. And so I wanted to talk about that, the mindset we should have for that. And I particularly wanted to address this popular saying that a lot of us have probably heard, which is you don't fail until you quit. And so this saying kind of encourages perseverance of, maybe you're doing something and you face a lot of obstacles with it, or maybe it just seems really hard. And, maybe somebody will say this of, don't give up at it. But, as well intended as this saying is, and it's something that, it might be good for the right things, but something we need to realize is that not everything we want to do is what we should be doing. So, sometimes sayings like this, when followed religiously, can lead us astray, because sometimes we want to do something, but it's not what's best for us. And maybe we don't even realize that. And so there are some things we need to quit in order to be successful in what we were truly meant to do. And a reason that's important is touched on in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. And in this passage, Jesus is speaking in part of his Sermon on the Mount. So starting in verse 19, lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And so I've done a video on this whole passage a while back, and I talked about how what we do with our time and energy is very important and has big implications. And we can think of our time and energy like a type of currency that, what you spend them on has an impact on you, and you make sacrifices. What you choose to do with your time and energy, you're also making the choice to not do other things. And so that's very important, because that's time and energy you can never get back. And again, not everything that we want to do is beneficial for us, and we have to spend time and energy we can never get back doing it, that we could have spent on something else. And, some people might think, oh, great, well, that just makes me feel even more stressed. But, that's not the end of it. It's not just, oh, make sure you make the right choice. Good luck with that. We get guidance from God when we seek it, and God knows exactly what we should be doing. And so that's a big point I want to make in this video. And the Bible tells us about that and how to do that as well. And so, addressing first the point about, maybe something we want to do um, is something that we shouldn't be doing. That can be tough to come to terms with, but there are some different factors that we need to keep in mind. For one thing, we may be better suited for something else. So, there's something that, maybe you want to do, um, and maybe you try to push past obstacles that get in the way with it, but there's something else that you would just be naturally better at, and it would bear a lot more good fruit for yourself and maybe others if you did that other thing. And that's not to say that if something's hard, oh, it must not be in the cards, give it up. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying if you really feel that, if you've sought God's guidance and he's showing that thing that you want to do isn't really right for you, that's a potential reason why. And so I'll give an example from my life. So when I first started college, I wanted to go into the sciences, and I was on a track uh, to become a chemist for a couple years. And so I got an associate's in science and started a bachelor's in chemistry. And it started to get more and more difficult over time, and I kind of started losing interest in it. But I had always been interested in history ever since I was a little kid. Um, and so I did kind of try to push past the obstacles at first, but I ultimately switched my major to history after I had a semester that didn't go so well, of me being a chemistry major. That was the last semester I was a chemistry major. And, it did feel in the moment like, there was some kind of defeat that I had just faced. But ultimately, I looked back and I realized that my reasons for pursuing chemistry um, weren't fully genuine. I just thought it sounded cool and would make me look like a brainiac and all that kind of stuff. Those were some of the big reasons, but I had a genuine love for history. And I also felt like I just had a better skill set, and was better suited for history. Um, my skill set wasn't necessarily solving complex math and science problems that chemistry required. I was much more into writing, forming arguments, debating, and things like that. And those are things that make a good historian. And so once I started as a history major, I had more of a genuine love for that and went on to be more successful with it. And like I said, felt I was better suited for it. And another thing we need to keep in mind is to not force things when we shouldn't. Sometimes we push for something to happen when it's either not the right time or we just don't need to force it. It's just not something that requires that. And again, that's not to say don't work hard, but sometimes we do push things too excessively when we shouldn't. And so I had a time, I've talked about like singleness and relationships and all that in different videos I've done. And I've said that I've never really got much into dating or things like that. Well, there was a brief span of my life of about several months where depression and several different factors kind of caused me to want to go out and find somebody and kind of, make up for lost time of never having dated up to that point. And so I tried to force things to happen with that. And I realized ultimately that I didn't need to push it. If it was God's will, I just needed to seek Him and let Him work it out. And so I realized that, ultimately just trying to force things with that just caused me more turmoil. And so that kind of speaks to the fact that sometimes we invent our own problems, um, but ultimately God has the solution. And that was a situation among other problems I've had in my life where when I focused more on God and made growing closer to God my priority, a lot of the stresses of those things lessened over time because I realized what truly had the most value. Another thing is that sometimes the things we do will eventually lead to bad outcomes, even if we don't realize that. Um, but again, ultimately, God does. I've had times before where maybe I had opportunities, and for one reason or another, I chose not to take it, and found out down the road that um, things ended up falling apart with that, and I would have went down with it had that been the case. Um, and so that's something to think about. If God is steering you away from something, of it seems fine, but again, it may seem fine, but you don't know everything about it. Maybe there's a certain job opportunity that you really want, and you end up not getting it, but there was a good reason for it. I remember there was one story that a professor I had several years ago shared, where he said that he had an opportunity as a tenured faculty member at another university, and he ultimately chose to work at a different university instead. And so it seemed outwardly like he passed up a really good deal, because being a tenured professor is pretty prestigious and it offers a lot of job security. But he said he found out several years later that that university ended up shutting down. And, he pretty much admitted, like, I would have been out of a job had I taken that position that, maybe some people would have said seemed better. And so that's kind of an example of that, of how something can look really good, um, and God still may steer you away from it for reasons you don't know about. And so ultimately, um, we should always strive to do what James 1:5 says, that if we lack wisdom, to seek God for it, who gives it liberally. And, I think that really, when you think about it, we lack wisdom all the time. Hopefully we're growing as, time goes on, but we never know everything. And so I think it's good to seek God for wisdom in everything that we do, and be willing to follow it. Again, even if it seems from your vantage point like it doesn't make sense, if you knew everything God did, it would make perfect sense. And so we need to trust Him. And a lot of people make wrong choices because they're led by the wrong thing. And sometimes that's their own emotions or what's popular around them. But those are both flawed, but God isn't. God's perfect. And Matthew 6:33 tells us that we need to ultimately seek God and His kingdom first, and He'll give what we need. Jesus said that verse in His Sermon on the Mountain. That point that He was getting at is, God will provide what we need. And again, it's what we need, not everything we want, because ultimately, when we serve God, to be closer to Him and to follow Him and receive His love and perfect guidance, that's what we should want. That's what we should want first and foremost. And so that's something we need to keep in mind. And, once God tells us and shows us what He wants to do, then I think we can apply that "you don't fail until you quit." Because when God's given it to you, it's what you need to have. And so I hope this video was helpful for someone who was maybe wrestling with, a big life choice they were trying to make. So hope it helped you. And until next time, God bless.